Good afternoon. Better? We call this the graveyard shift in the university when we have a 2 o'clock lecture in the afternoon, after lunch. So I was wondering, should I make it sharp or should I make it soft and have all of you think everything is very nice? How should I do the lecture? But let me start with the preliminaries first. A big thank you to Giovanni, to the department, and the colleagues here, and to the University of Turin for this invitation. It's my very first time here in Turin. And the conversations I've had since yesterday, I think, would lead to a wonderful partnership between both our universities. I hope some of you, in due course of time, will be able to come to New Delhi and India, and also to my university. With these words, I have the pleasant task of talking to you about India-EU relations in a changing world. And the view is from India, though I am an expert on Europe, and I would probably, my heart would stand very much in Europe. But at this point, I'm going to be looking at Europe from a very, precise point of locating myself within India and South Asia. What I intend to do in the time which has been given to me is to take you through a much more analytical and at times, throw up some questions for you to think about. And I'll offer it in terms of looking at India-EU relations by asking 4 sets of specific things. The first, I want to frame it by asking, how do we see this changing world? I think it's extremely important to locate that in terms of the larger question that you're asking. Second, what are the main points for consideration once we have said that there is a changing world? Locate the India-EU relations in the axis of this changing world, and then what is the way forward as I look at it. So let me start by addressing the first framework for our reference this afternoon, and that is about a changing world. I think you can't miss a day or a headline every other day when these 2 words have started appearing regularly. At least in the last 1 year, if somebody was to do a content analysis of newspaper headings, then a changing world has become the dominating frame in which a lot of the conversations on international politics and international relations, and more specifically on foreign policy, has been taking place, right? It gives us the assumption that a changing world is something new. And for students of international politics and international relations, I think we would recognize that a changing world is something that is very integral to the study of our discipline, right? You're always being engaging with a changing world. The notion of stability is actually misplaced when you look at a changing world, because what is inherently present is the dynamic element of international politics, and which also draws attention to the fact that what we look at, something which is extremely stable and given, does not actually appear to be so. But be that as it may, that is what we're looking at in a changing world. And if I were to pick up 2 words in a changing world and offer that to you as a way to further frame the conversation, then the 2 words are cooperation and contestation, right? We could look at the changing world from the lens of where is it that states are cooperating, and where is it that on the other axis contestation is taking place. So what is it that enables cooperation to take place on the one hand, and then what is it that also leads to contestation? And sometimes this co-op and contestation can coexist together between even 2 sets of same actors. Right? It's not that you have 2 very different blocks, as often the case is when you're looking at it very theoretically. You could look at the classic case of the G2 or current G2 of the US and China, where you're talking of contestation on every axis. But on the other hand, there's also a very large trade partnership between both of them. Right? So it's a good way to ask ourselves that in this changing world, if I were to locate it on these 2 words of cooperation and contestation, then what kind of a bandwidth is available to examine how states, and very importantly bringing the other kind of factors into it, they are looking at the space or the field which is there between them. So when we're looking at the relation between states and defining it as that, I think we've also got to examine a very, very important and critical point, and that is about the idea of stability, which has become extremely important to this notion of a changing world when we're talking about. One of the things for policymakers is, of course, they're looking at an unprecedented scale of unpredictability. I think that is what is the major takeaway that you get when you talk to policymakers, right? So it's also feeding into the other assumption, which we as students of international relations take it, is that the system is always producing near perfect results, point number one. Point number two is that we're also talking of predictability as a given, right? And I think I would call your attention to it and say predictability is never given. Predictability is what we assume exists because the relations between states have been managed. And that managing of that relations produces a net effect of a certain element of predictability. What happens if you introduce elements of discord into that bilateral relations, into those multilateral relations? What is it that then it produces? And that's where you get the dissonance of unpredictability coming about, right? So unpredictability is not merely a function of something of a dissonance in one particular area. It can be caused by numerous set of factors, but one of the definitive takeaways in today's changing world that you're talking about is this extreme unpredictability, which makes it difficult for policymakers in terms of being able to augment the response side of it, right? So when you're looking at a state and the ability to respond, two important questions come up. Is a state as an actor being more in a proactive mode, or is it in a reactive mode, right? And if you're always going to be reactive, that means you're waiting for some event to take place and then set into motion a policy response. There's going to be tremendous cost about it. Because if you're coming from a place of not being prepared for it, the cost of reaction is far greater than the cost of... and I will then connect this changing. I mean, you must be thinking why there is no India and why there is no EU till now, because I want to set the frame on this, and then I will come to where India and EU are there in this changing world. A third point I want to highlight in the changing world is our expanding, evidence that we have of how critical actors are also, becoming significantly important in this whole idea of the changing world. So you have to expand who the actors are by looking not merely at the states, but also look at the whole arena of the non-state actors which have also come in and become extremely important. If you assume that it is only the state which has the full driving force, which has a command over everything, which can define the result, then I think we are going to at best have a 50% understanding, and we will never get a better solution. Okay, so we have to recognize that there's a huge role which non-state actors have taken on, and these non-state actors are both benign and they can also be malignant in that sense. That means some of them can be helpful to the processes of international politics, others are also going to be what we would call as spoilers to the international process, and then that can produce a kind of effect, but then the state as an actor is stepping in and does not have control over the non-state actor in terms of what they are doing, right? Another important element in this whole process of a changing world, is also to look at how the significance of certain important issues have now come onto the table of global governance, right? So if all collective action is going into the area of producing global public goods, which almost every state is consuming, every individual within that state is consuming, then how is it this notion of a changing world, with its two bookends of cooperation and contestation, is designing or addressing the problem of global public goods? I think that is an important point which I would like to put on the table over here. Coming from that, it takes me to my second frame which I would like to offer you people today, and that is what are the main points for consideration based on the changing world that one can talk about. I think the first thing that I would like to offer you for your consideration is about the changing power shift which is taking place. One way of looking at it is the way Joseph Nye has pointed out, that international politics is a three-dimensional chess set. On that pyramid, if you're familiar with Joseph Nye's pyramid, then at the top of the pyramid you have military power, right? It's the smallest part of the triangle. It means there are very select few states over there which are having that kind of military capability and capacity for action, which can outsmart any other state, right? But here we are talking about states. I just mentioned to you about non-state actors. I will come to you why, when we're looking at Joseph Nye's triangle, a non-state actor can really, impose a very heavy collateral damage which the state can never consider. So you've got the top of the military at the triangle. The middle part is the fascinating part where a lot of action is taking place today in the present. And that is the economic part which Joseph Nye is talking about. It's a very expanding area of economic multipolarity, right? And that's an important point to consider, which means that if you're looking at numerous economically powerful states which can, if they should want, come together and produce certain kind of outcomes which can be desirable for them and undesirable for others, right? So that means this is not about locating the states. I'm not talking about this in terms of ideology. It's important to recognize that these states are powerful actors irrespective of the ideology that they have, right? So please don't get caught into the idea of just the ideology being the defining element. That's not it. But these are powerful actors. And I could give you one example. I would situate India over there. India is the world's 5th largest global economy. Right? It has, in April, also got a new #1 position. If that was a race going on, India is today the world's largest population is in India, and we've just become the 5th largest economy. A footnote on the terms of using statistics for all of us. When you take it in, GDP terms, India is the 5th largest. But given the size of the population, if I was to bring in per capita income, then India would definitely go down. Right? So you have to recognize which kind of statistics you use to apply and the kind of answer that you can bring to the table. So going back to Joseph Nye, we've got the military, we've got the economic multipolarity. And very interestingly, when you come to the base of the triangle, Joseph Nye is talking about, it's about the transnational issues. No one state can dominate the transnational, right? And the most recent example of this inability to bring all your assets into play was the pandemic. You could be the topmost military power in the world. Answer to that would be the United States. But your army is not going to help you with all your R&D of the next 10 countries put together, take on a pandemic which can strike you at any moment. I think if we were collectively made aware of the vulnerability of our achievements at the political level, at the economic level, at the military level, you just have to come down to the transnational level to recognize the kind of vulnerabilities even the most powerful states can face, right? So I think Nye's triangle is a good way, as a student of international politics, to recognize that never look at power from a unidimensional framework, look at it from a multidimensional perspective, break it down into the political, economic, the military and the transnational, and add to the element of the social culture, which can also produce deliverables which sometimes other things cannot do. As a consequence of the changing world, apart from the changing power shift which I just mentioned, I draw your attention to the new groupings that you find emerging in international politics, right? One way of looking at these groupings would be to divide it on the idea of multilateralism as a principle which organizes collective action, right? And if you look at multilateralism as organizing for collective action to produce global public goods, then the first example which comes to mind is the United Nations, right? And of course, I'm sure all of you have your questions on whether the United Nations is functioning perfectly at this point, or should we jettison it and get something else? But multilateralism, as we know, in the formal, organized way, where every state, has a presence, and we are almost at the end of October. September is the great, General Assembly week. We're actually just 2 days away since the UN Day was celebrated on the 24th of October. The UN continues to remain a fundamentally important point of the way multilateralism is organized. It has flaws in it. It's not producing the kind of outcome it wants to produce, but that is the formal, structured way. But more recently, all of you would have heard words like, the Quad, the ACUS, the BRICS, the IPSA, or the BRICS Plus, the SEO. All of these are groupings which are coming up and which draw our attention to the way cooperation is happening away from the formal organized multilateral, right? And that means we are looking at informal groupings coming in. One of the largest informal grouping, two of them, and the distance between them is also very important. The 70s produced the G7 in the face of the oil crisis, and in the face of the financial crisis, we got the G20. And India recently had the chairmanship. We, in fact, this month, a little further, will complete the chairmanship of the G20, which has now turned out to be almost 80% of the world are represented in the G20, and the African Union was brought in at the New Delhi summit, which took place last month, right? And a big question was asked is, so much can be achieved in an informal grouping. Remember, the informal doesn't bind anybody, but it's not about naming and shaming, but it's also about what collective action can be achieved. The journey from the G20 of summit held in Bali last year, when Indonesia had the presidency of the summit, to this year where India had the summit, has been a long and difficult journey. The reason was last year on 24th of February, the war in Ukraine started, and as a result, when the Bali summit took place in November of last year, it was extremely difficult to build any kind of consensus on the summit statement. When the summit took place in Delhi in the first week, the second week of September, questions were being asked whether there would be a summit declaration in Delhi, and I think India was able to pull it off, get a summit declaration on the first day itself. Almost by afternoon, the summit declaration was out. And the reason the summit declaration came out is because instead of focusing on the two words I gave you in the beginning about the changing world order, that is contestation, the states decided to cooperate, right? And so this tells us fundamentally about what the power of cooperation is when leadership, and this is extremely important for recognizing that cooperation can only happen when there is a political will to bring about that kind of a desired effort. Otherwise, that same political leadership can decide to go to the other end of the spectrum, which is contestation, right? So the journey from Bali to New Delhi is also a journey about the ability of states to come together and build and not show just contestation. But more interestingly, just to finish on the number of groupings that we have, the G20 now moves into a term which I would like to introduce to all of you. You've been reading about it, is the Global South, right? And now, in the next some years, after Indonesia, it's India, it moves into what is, we could get the acronym IPSA, India, Brazil, South Africa. After India, it goes to Brazil, and then it comes to South Africa, right? So in the next 2 years, basically the G20 leadership has moved to the Global South. And that would have a very definitive impact on the kind of policy initiative ideas which will come. One of the significant takeaways was of expanding the G20 to get one more regional integration organization. The European Union has been there, but now to get the African Union, right? So we're seeing the shifting base of cooperation which is also happening within the G20. And one of the important takeaways, if I leave you, and which I will then pull back into the India-EU, is also the impact of these two critical words which are now also become part of our lexicon in an everyday fashion, and that is geopolitics and geoeconomics. Right? And what you saw in the G20 summit was the inability to actually create a firewall between the geopolitics and the geoeconomics. Right? I mean, increasingly geopolitics is entering and setting the agenda of geopolitics. And I also would like to draw your attention that the calendars which is followed by politics and economics, are not overlapping. Right? Politics has shorter timetables, because they are run based on elections. As election cycles produce new results, political and public policy will have to, increasingly factor in that. Whereas business follows much long-term cycles, right? And that's the disconnect we see between politics and business in terms of addressing some of these challenges. And a final takeaway for considering in terms of the changing order is about new and old contestations. I'd like to come back in terms of from the groupings. At this point, if I were to give you an example, I would link up three, within a year, we've got three hotspots of contestations. I say hotspot because there's a war going on, right? It's not just an economic contestation. So we start off with Ukraine, Russia-Ukraine happening. We've got Nagorno-Karabakh, and then as of now, a month or so, we have Israel and Gaza happening, right? There is a multiplicity of actors in each of these conflicts. There are those actors which are visible in the front, there are those which are not visible in the front. There are also non-state actors which are involved over here. There are businesses which are involved and interconnected, right? 2 days back, before coming to Turin, and Giovanni was very kind in shifting the lecture for me. I was in Münster, something which is extremely important to us as students of international politics. Münster is celebrating, or was celebrating, 375 years of the Treaty of Westphalia. Right? And when we think about it, it's been 375 years. Westphalia was the coming of peace after 5 years of negotiations for the 30-year war, and many of the other actors which was there. Right? And I thought the irony couldn't be more stark. Okay? Also, 24th October, it's 375 years of the Treaty of Westphalia. It was also UN Day, right? And there are three major, sites of contestation going on simultaneously, and you would just kind of, be cynical if you've not had enough coffee. I don't know, if you get up too early in the morning and you look at the world news, it's not going to make you very happy today. But you could be cynical and say, what UN? Come on, I mean, it's failed. What peace? What peace of Westphalia, right? The big takeaway of Westphalia was territory, sovereignty, and international law came together. And they continue to be the way we define the primary unit of analysis in international politics even today. We haven't gone away from the state. I don't see any other alternative coming up. Whenever there's a major crisis, we all reach out to the state, right? So, I mean, that is the kind of embeddedness that an idea can have, and that's what Westphalia is about. But when I talk about new and old contestations, the three wars, what you see is some of it is the obvious, what is happening on the top, and what you don't see is the legacy of the past into which all these three wars are interconnected with, in terms of the actors' own engagement with those countries, right? And as a result, you've got a very, very complex matrix in which these contestations are playing across, not just primarily as, Israel and, the Gaza, but there's also about the history of the region over there, the history of where there's a movement towards resetting the political balance, about jettisoning the past contestation, and in all of that, and please keep in mind that as a way of moving forward, a huge connectivity project was announced in the New Delhi G20 summit. It was the IMEC corridor, India, Middle East, Europe corridor. Right? I can't tell you the irony of it. On 6th of October, I think it's a Friday, if I remember the calendar correctly, I was giving a talk in the evening in New Delhi on the IMEC. Wow, this is like unprecedented. India, Middle East, Europe, all together connected, right? In a world of connectivity projects, this was one more. Sometimes I can be cynical, and I was thinking before I went for the talk, should I put on my cynical hat or should I put on my optimist hat? And I said, no, I better go with optimism. Right? And I said, if this comes through, this would be unprecedented because it is going through what we call as lines of contestation, lines of conflict which are embedded in those sands. Right? And if this should come through, a railway line going from Saudi Arabia all the way into the port of Haifa, taking goods, I mean, wow, if that happens. Next day morning we got the bombing. That's the end of an idea, at least for now. Right? So you have to also recognize that while politics may be willing to take forward unprecedented kinds of decisions to cooperate, there can be what we call, from a peace and conflict studies point of view, we call spoilers to the process, and that's what you saw happening over there, right? But a new line was opening up, which is gone. So that's the first part of what I was wanting to put on record in terms of the changing world and the points of consideration as we look at this changing. And I now come into the second part of my talk, which is in this context I would like to offer to you certain points of consideration for India-EU relations. So where does that fit in a changing world? Where's the opportunity over here? What is being done? What is being left unsaid? How do we look at it? So, as you look at the India-EU relations, let me position the relations for you first at the outset. At this point, it is a relationship which spans 6 decades. That means 60 years of an India-EU relationship. This has evolved in a very significant fashion. It has gone from being a partnership of development cooperation between the then European Economic Community and a developing India, right? So if you look at the period from 1962-63, when the relationship started, till 1990, this was the framing one. The end of Cold War did 2 very important things, both for the European Union and India. And that's important to put it on. It's the transformation in the actor and actorness of both that took place. I want to emphasize that. Let me put India first. 1990, as the Cold War came to an end, India also found itself coming out of the Cold War rubrics. For that point in time, India had followed a foreign policy which was famously called non-alignment, right? Not being part of any of those 2 blocks or the superpowers, the Western and the Eastern, but rather building a third way in international politics, which was called the non-aligned movement. And India was now getting out of it, right? 1990, as German unification took place on 3rd of October, by 1991 December, the Soviet Union had imploded, leaving behind Russia as the residual state. Which would then get the 2 important powers, which is the permanent seat in the UN Security Council and the nuclear weapons, something which is extremely critical in the context of the war in Ukraine, because there was a Budapest Agreement at that point in time when Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons to Russia in that point. So India, finding that there's a whole new world and a whole new terrain opening up. And for many, if you're not aware, India has always had adopted Western-style democracy right from the time of independence, right? A West-ministerial form of government, parliamentary form of government, a West-ministerial one that means ideationally had been close to the West, but all during the Cold War located on the other side of the axis, much closer to Moscow, right? That's what the Cold War had produced. The European Economic Community, with the unification of Germany, would undergo a massive, reorganization, moving from purely an economic entity, and with the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992 becoming the European Union. Introducing for the first time not only cooperation on the economic and the trade dimension, which was already there, but as your students of European studies are familiar, that the 3-pillar architecture was born with the Maastricht Treaty, which was then removed by the Lisbon Treaty in 2009. So here is the creation of a new actor, the European Union. It is unprecedented in the annals of regional integration because you do not have, if you look around the world and do a comparative analysis of regional integration, you will not find any other area so advanced in integration as the European Union. This is a formalized integration. ASEAN can come a closer second, and my part of the world, South Asia, comes last. We are still in the world of conflictual dynamics. We haven't been able to convert and move into what we would call as a peace dynamics, which can produce the kind of peace dividend that Western Europe saw between 1952, when the European Coal and Steel Community was launched, and the subsequent growing to the Treaty of Maastricht, right? So here are two new actors for India. Like I said, let me just roll back. The end of the Cold War rubric, it also created a point of an economic crisis. India went in for a major economic restructuring which took place in 1992. And this would open up, the Indian economy, producing a massive result by the late 90s. One of the things which caught the attention of the West at that point in time, because if there was one Asian country which really had access to the West, where the love affair with that Asian country had begun much earlier, that was China. India was really not on the map. India did not figure on this. India was looked still at from a lens of development cooperation. In 1998, India went in for the second nuclear test. This nuclear test in a few weeks would change the political and the weapons balance in the South Asian subcontinent, because Pakistan as a result would also go nuclear. Right. So within a short span of time, you had two of the neighboring countries going nuclear, not being recognized globally as such as having nuclear capability and capacity. Right. So this would change the entire evaluation of the West. For a short period of time, India came in for massive economic sanctions from the West, and then subsequently it was done away. India, please, I would draw your attention, is not in any way violating any of the international protocols, because India is not a signatory to the NPT or the CTBT. Right? So it was not in violation. If you're looking at what has happened to Iran, for example, Iran is signed to the additional protocols, and so what you got as a consequence of the negotiations with the United States and the European Union and the big three in the EU was the JCPOA, right? So India did not violate any international obligation. That's an important point to keep in mind. But the early 90s did not automatically lead to a transformation in the relationship between India and the European Union, right? If I look at the Asia policy of 1994, which was launched by the European Union, India was still being seen from the lens of development cooperation, it was this nuclear test in 1998 which was kind of put the genie out of the bottle. Because by 2000, you can see the shift happening. So the convergence of the economic growth as a consequence of the liberalized economy which came through, and a second, the political consequences of a nuclear test would produce an optimal outcome, whereby in 2000, the European Union was willing to transform its lens of engagement with India. And what came through over that point in time was the launch of the summit-level meetings between the European Union and India. Both were now agreeing to look at each other from a different perspective, right? For the EU, there was somebody else in the Asian region other than China which was interesting to engage with. By then, the Indian economy had really taken off, right? Growth was happening in massive terms, and India was now seen as some kind of a middleweight country, which would definitely be interesting, right? India is more in love with bilateral relationships, right? India likes to, talk to Italy, to France, to Germany, to Spain on that kind of an equation, and not like to talk to the European Union and Brussels. Brussels is something of a moving target which Indian bureaucracy would not be very happy with. And so the preference for bilateral was also a consequence of, in New Delhi, the member states of the European Union competing for attention of New Delhi and competing with each other and also with Brussels, with the European Union. So, I mean, what do you get? You will get the best. In that sense, the winner is India, because India can then play one against the other, right? So it's taken a while for the India-EU equation actually to move forward, and 2000 was when the summit-level talks began. 3 years down the road, in 2004, you find that there's a dramatic shift. India and EU start off the strategic partnership. Now, the strategic partnership cannot all be attributed only to the improving relations between India and the EU. That would be not a right analysis of it. One has to roll back 2 years back. You have to go back to 2001, the attack on the United States, 9/11. 2003, the war in Iraq, the kind of dissonance it produced in the transatlantic relationship with France and Germany not accepting the evidence put forward by the then Secretary of State Colin Powell in the UN Security Council, the crisis which would lead Javier Solana to come up with a document for the European Union leading in December of 2003 to the European Security Strategy. Right? Identifying the 5 threats, and out of that, right at the very end of that very short document, you find the line on partnerships. A very important turning point in terms of the first document of the European Union which talks about the EU as a nascent security actor. Okay, here it is coming out. And one of the countries identified over there was India. Right? So 2003 is when the European Security Strategy is repositioning the European Union, if I want to put it that way, but it also produced that kind of momentum in which then it would lead to the strategic partnership being launched in 2004. In 2005, in order to take forward the strategic partnership, the Joint Action Plan was launched. It's a very, very long document. All of these documents are available on the EU website, so you can access them if you're interested. Let me just flag the Joint Action Plan. I have written in an article somewhere, it was like a Christmas wish list. I mean, if you are asked the entire year, and you ask children as parents, what would you like? You can have a large wish list by the end, and you know that on Christmas Day, you told your parents you wanted 45 items, and you're going to get 3 of them. Huge political, economic, socio-cultural, you name it, everything was packed in over there. So that means it became very heavy in terms of what it would want. 2008, there was a review of the strategic partnership in France, when France had the presidency at that point in time. But one of the things it did was it repositioned the equation between New Delhi and Brussels to look at each other not merely as partners in trade, but to reposition each other as being critically strategic partners. There's a lot of literature available on strategic partnership. There are those who criticize the EU strategic partnership for not being either a strategy or a partnership. So then that's that one end of the argument. I have personally said that a strategic partnership is a signaling device for expanding and enhancing the intensity of the relationship between existing relations between two countries. That's how I look at the strategic partnership. So that means it's a very designed, intentioned signaling of raising the level of engagement. It also means you're prioritizing your relations with your strategic partners as differently from other countries with whom you do have bilateral relations. So within the India-EU, in a changing world, in 2008, the review took place. There was an important point over here, and that was the launching of the negotiations on the free trade agreement between India and the EU in 2007. Trade has always defined the relationship between India and the European Union. Right? This was the way the relationship had grown, and it was but obvious that if there was one thing which was going to be pushed in the strategic partnership forward, that would be the trade. So good. We started having negotiations on getting a free trade agreement, and what do you think happened? Well, we had many, many rounds of negotiations, and we finally hit a roadblock. We did not get a trade agreement. In fact, the trade agreement had to be, the FTA had to be abandoned. That was the end. Not only was the FTA abandoned, the relationship also between India and the EU, went down. We missed our dateline with summits. We did not have two summits at all in between, and it was only subsequently that we came back to it. This is also because of numerous things which are happening, but it's interesting that in all of this, the bilateral relation, is actually well maintained through institutional collaboration on both sides. There are lots of mechanisms, many committees, many modalities are there by which the India-EU, engage with each other. But the period from the COVID and subsequently till now has in fact proved extremely interesting in repositioning the India-EU strategic partnership, right? And that's where I connect up now to the changed world. We'll go back and pull a little bit of Joseph Nye and interconnect it and see where is the India-EU strategic partnership today. So one of the things, and that's to take from the transnational, 2019, as the year ended and 2020 began, we were introduced to the world of the pandemic. Initially, I think everybody thought it was going to be short term. Nobody thought everything is going to, shut down the way it did or continue for the next 2 years, and the way it would impact our everyday lives. And in all of this, the collaboration between India and the EU also, while it continued, you could see that there was really a run on every country level or at a national level to develop a vaccine for that, right? So we started experiencing vaccine nationalism rather than vaccine cooperation, right? And that has been consequential in impacting one of the global public goods, and that is public health. And this is where we have now come back in terms of the India-EU cooperation. But interestingly enough, in 2020, in all of the pandemic, we were able to take forward our summit meetings. It was virtual summits, but two important developments took place. One was we in 2020 launched the Strategic Roadmap 2025. This was to kind of give a new push to the India-EU relations in the context of the changing world that was taking place. The pandemic had brought up a very important factor about how business was being conducted. Something which has become part of our everyday lexicon, and that's about talking about global supply chains, right? The dependence on China, the single supply chain in terms of global manufacturing and supplying some of the most important parts for economic development really came forward on the table, right? Causing a great amount of rethink in terms of how is your equation or relationship to China to be repositioned after this, right? And I think that's an important point to keep in mind. A second important thing as a consequence of this was there was also a more willingness within the European Union, if I should put it that way, to look at other countries with whom there is a strategic partnership. And that's where I think India gets that kind of a benefit, where they said, okay, this is where we could also expand, and the Strategic Roadmap 2025 is a critical component in repositioning of the India-EU strategic partnership. As a consequence, further also of the EU launching its own, connectivity, plans in 2021, India and EU then also expanded to take forward the India-EU connectivity partnership. 4 areas were identified in this in order to build the connectivity, and then to work at taking, the trade, the digital, the energy, and the people-to-people, the 4 areas, onto third countries as well. That means working together as partners and going to third countries was something which was also envisioned and brought about. And a more significant development in all of this was bringing back the free trade agreement. I think that was a remarkable breakthrough which was achieved in the last 3 years by bringing back negotiations on the trade agreement, but this time not putting everything in to an FTA, but keeping trade separate, investment separate, and then looking at how to take it forward. What has been a contributing factor in the talks, and they are running quite well on schedule at this point in time, from my conversations both within the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi and talking to colleagues from Brussels, there is a certain optimism that the talks are moving ahead. But remember, these talks happened earlier in 2007. It was a different world at that point in time. Today is a much different world, right? And one of the points which can come, it has not hit the India-EU trade talks, but definitely the war in Ukraine has created a new sense of urgency in Europe, which is not the way things are viewed in New Delhi. And this is important to keep in mind. How does the same event produce different kind of political and economic reactions around the world? As students of international politics, do not think that just because you live next to an event which is happening, everybody will automatically feel that same sense of urgency, or uses that same lens or the same argument to take away as analysis, right? That's a fallacy. That's the biggest fallacy. One cannot also, just say that just because it is happening here, everybody has to respond. And this is where the attention came onto the global south. If I had 3 points on the free trade agreement, on that, an important development which has taken place is that the EU and India have a Trade and Technology Council. This is being created. The only other country with whom the EU has it is with the United States. And this is a clear indication of the kind of attention the EU wants to put in to negotiate a trade agreement with India at this point. Just prior to this coming about, India was also extremely reluctant to be doing trade agreements with other countries. In the last 3 years, we've seen that reluctance has been set aside, and India is also moving ahead with new trade agreements with third countries. So that is an important point, which is facilitating the trade agreement, which is still being negotiated. It's going to still be time to take. The challenge is for both of us as actors. We are democracies, and as democracies, the one thing which will periodically come up is elections. Right, so you go into the political calendar, and you will find that elections will come up, and as a consequence of elections coming up, the challenge then becomes is to keep the talks going on, because once you're moving towards an election calendar, there's very little space available for political negotiations which are happening on the external, right? So this is something which both sides will seek to insulate from the everyday politics, of the election calendar. So that is where the state of affairs is between India and the EU. Let me use the next some minutes to give you a kind of concluding remarks on this and take it forward. So where is India and EU in the context of the current state of affairs? All of you have read about it and constantly get a news every day of the war in Ukraine. That is something which probably, when I see it from New Delhi, has probably sucked out the oxygen for anything else. Right? That is the dominant point on the agenda at the European level. That's the kind of feeling one gets in New Delhi. For those who followed the voting in the United States, in the United Nations, the United Nations being in the United States. In the United Nations, then you would have seen that India did not vote with what is called as this binary division of the lens of looking at what is happening in Ukraine. This is a consequence of the way the American foreign policy has presented the war externally. Right? A war between democracy and autocracy. If you look at it in the context of the Treaty of Westphalia and the Peace of Westphalia, which has been celebrating now 375 years, the three important trinity which comes out of the Westphalian Accord is about territory, sovereignty, and international law. Right? India refused, and many people said that India was supporting, as a consequence of abstaining in the vote. India was actually supporting Russia and Russia's actions. That is not the way I would look at it, and that would be a very, very limited understanding of India's foreign policy and where India's own engagement with the countries in Europe is. And I would draw your attention to that point. I could probably take it up in the Q&A. The important point to keep here in mind is that one would see the war in Europe as creating a new fault line. A fault line where states in the global north, in particular the West, have come together to call it as a war against an autocracy, a war against an authoritarian system, right? It oversimplifies the problem in terms of what is happening in Ukraine. if you do not bring onto the table the fact of the legacy issue of what remains in that part of the world. That's an important thing to consider. Did it, impact the India-EU relations? At one level, member states at an individual level reached out to New Delhi to find out what is the position of India in its voting and in its foreign policy. There was also an attempt, to push India. If I should use as an academic, I'm not representing the government. I'm very happy I can be as free and, in talking about it. But I can tell you that, there was pressure on the government to say that, you have to break away and you have to be with us. Definitely not in the way George Bush did in his time, the war in Iraq. It's our way or the highway, right? I mean, when France and Germany refused in 2003 to stand with America, and the famous statement we got from Donald Rumsfeld about, Poland and Hungary who were supporting. And remember, they had not yet joined the European Union. That happened only in 2004. But Donald Rumsfeld then said that, new Europe is better than old Europe. That was a very famous statement at that point in time, right? So we didn't get a fault line, though we did get a lot of pressure on New Delhi to change its position, change its understanding. And I think the fact that we have continued the conversation, that the fact that the free trade agreement is on track, the negotiations are going on, also tells you about the resilience of the India-EU strategic partnership in recognizing that there has to be an understanding that ideational proximity does not produce interest convergence automatically. Yeah? This is something which is considered an automatic. If you are ideationally close, that means if you subscribe to the same set of ideas, you all should stand together. It doesn't happen that way. And that point forgets a fundamental fact of international politics, that we are situated in different geographies of the world. And when we are situated in different geographies of the world, the problems we encounter are often shaped, at least 50% of the problems are shaped by your geography. So while a German concern may be there that the border is, not very far, and we encounter the first refugees, and Germany will not understand what Italy undergoes when the refugees are coming from the South Mediterranean. You may not appreciate New Delhi's concern that we share a border with China, a border which is not yet fully secured. There are points on the border which are still contested between India and China. We have had one war with China in 1962. And then from 2020, during the height of, as COVID was building up, the India-China relations went globally south. They just moved south. They just went bad. We had the first big standoff in 2020, and subsequently it's been happening, right? And China has been augmenting its strength at the border with India. While India has taken measures to, prevent certain Chinese digital businesses to operate in India, on the contrary, if you look at the trade flows between India and China, India's imports from China have actually gone up, and that's the reality that everybody encounters, right? So, some quick final concluding words in terms of where we are in this changing world, and how can India and EU improve or move ahead, at least in terms of the balance sheet of their relationship. One, I would say that the last 3 years have been interesting because if I go back to Nye's three-dimensional chess view of global politics, then the third level, the transnational level, has opened up both an opportunity and a challenge. It's an opportunity because our global response to the pandemic showed how ill-prepared we were globally to address public health, and how it doesn't matter how advanced you are economically, how good your per capita income is, if you cannot put public health on the forefront it can take you down in no time, right? And that is one area which has opened up tremendous opportunity for cooperation. A second point which is opened up, which is also about climate change. Climate change is no longer something which is happening, another 20 years from now. It's happened yesterday, and we are facing the consequences of it. And one of the important points is, how do we all collectively work together to address the challenge of climate change, right? A lot of the technology is here in the global north. A lot of the requirement in stemming some of the negative consequences of climate change is in the global south. A partnership is essential. It cannot be a contestation, because that is going to take all of us down into the spiral where nobody is going to be the winner. But unfortunately, we have not been able to convert this challenge as a win-win partnership for both sides. On the India-EU, definitely climate change is one of the important deliverables on the strategic partnership, where then, if you look at it from a member state point of view, you can see a lot of effort going into addressing where some of these climate partnerships can be built, where you can strategize and bring a better way to minimize and create adaptability to some of the challenges which are coming up in climate change. A third thing which can be a big opportunity has come out of both. One is a geography of interest which has emerged, about which I have not spoken about till now, and that's the Indo-Pacific. In the last 4 to 5 years, it's become a fashionable word in international politics. If I am cynical, I'm missing a 4 o'clock coffee just now. I could say it's opened up the opportunity for at least a 10-year industry on Indo-Pacific. It's a new term. That's because of the way it is positioned. It's not a new area in which we are all fishing. Please recognize that. Okay, the Indo-Pacific, as the waters of whether you call it the Asia-Pacific, depending on your foreign policy, or since Shinzo Abe in 2007 spoke about the Indo-Pacific, it is actually repositioning how we look at geopolitics today. And that is an extremely critical point which has come up also in the India-EU relations. So India-EU is now looking at a track 1.5 maritime security dialogue. We're having a 1.5 political dialogue. All of these are looking at how to create a synergy in the Indo-Pacific, which is, please recognize, one of the most important sea lanes of communication, which is also then coinciding or converging with your supply chains, which are also located in that part of the world, right? By bringing in a term which defines the region as the Indo-Pacific, it has expanded the kind of region, the number of countries, the kind of partnerships, and the two words with which I started my presentation earlier, both the scope for cooperation and contestation, right? You've got the AUKUS over here, you've got the Quad over here, you've got the Quad coming out of a response to a tsunami, then disappearing, and now the Quad meeting regularly, right? You've also got countries in the Indo-Pacific which are part of another point I said in the first part of my talk about new groupings which are coming up, which is, the BRICS, which are also over there. So, finally, to conclude and probably have a little bit of discussion with all of you, I think you're looking at three sets of issues in the India-EU relations. One, new contestations in close geographies of both, that means close to Europe and close to India, are producing fault lines which have a significant impact on the way India and EU look at each other. Okay, it is opening up a possibility for partnership, but you also find elements of contestation are there. Point number two. The talk about expanding, your global supply chains has offered a new opportunity for India to present itself as one of the countries where the EU and EU member states can look for what is called as friendshoring. Right? So we're talking about nearshoring, homeshoring, and friendshoring. When we're talking of manufacturing, where do you locate your industry? And India says, we assure you, you can come to India, and you know, why don't you look at that? So that has become an opportunity which is emerging in terms of this. A third point which I would look at, and that is to look at in terms of the larger interests, and that is to see how can India and the EU align their interest and go beyond just the normative connect which we talk about. Because often when I'm teaching in India or the European Union, I talk about the EU as a normative actor. The EU which is the norm producer. The EU which is the first in setting up the GDPR, the regime on data protection. Right? Everybody else has to follow the line on that. But it's not that the EU is the only one which has the full right to create norms. But norms are extremely important in the sense the way the EU conducts its business. But in terms of larger global public goods, in terms of the kind of challenges we are facing in the future, India and the European Union definitely have a significant advantage of taking 60 years of relationship together and coming to the forefront, in which they can fashion some of the elements of global public goods and global governance far more differently because of the two large geographies of population which reside in both the actors. So there's a tremendous opportunity over there, and I hope in the coming years we will quickly see, at least by sometime next year, the free trade agreement being concluded, which will be a sign of how a business of opportunity can be converted into one of long-term engagement. So let me stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And now let's open the floor immediately to your question and thoughts. So please feel free to raise your hand and take the mic. And so let's start.
I can tell you I'm very happy. We have the same response if Giovanni was to come to my university. Everybody will be quiet. Somebody has to go first. And then in the last 10 minutes we have 20 questions.
Yeah. It's the same everywhere. Who is the icebreaker? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Rebecca, I'm Italian, and my question is about the problem with India-China borders. So you said that the uncertainty about India about the invasion of Ukraine was also a security matter because of the border that is shared with China. So my question is New Delhi concerned about any kind of military retaliation from China? And if so, why does New Delhi not seek any help within the EU relation or the Western relation in general? Thank you.
So thank you for the question, Rebecca. So by India abstaining on the vote against Russia, what many people are not aware is that Russia is India's largest military supplier. More than 75% of India's defense is Russian. And that we're talking of all kinds of equipment over there. And so there is an extremely critical security component in that relationship. It's a relationship which has withstood change even in the Soviet Union, in the sense of Soviet Union disappearing and Russia coming into the picture, and then Russia still continuing to support and provide. That's the first point. And so India needs Russia in the sense of what it can give for its own security. The West has not been a supplier of weapons to India, right? It has not wanted to do that. There have been terms and conditions which have not been good for India, and so India has not gone in for that. But slowly these things are changing. As far as India is not fearing a retaliation from China. I mean, militarily at this point we are looking at de-escalating. Winter is setting in, and we have got troops at a very high level, on the mountains on both sides. And it is very important to de-escalate because you don't want anything to be caught in the escalation cycle over there. But as far as taking assistance is concerned, India has always been averse to the idea of alliances. From foreign policy which followed non-alignment to one which is now looking at strategic partnerships with a lot of countries. So we have a strategic partnership also with the United States. But India will not get into any kind of a military alliance, will not look at. And I think what you will appreciate over here is that in 2020 when China made these inroads on the border, we did not get any reaction from the European Union or the Western countries. So you have to also appreciate over here a very important point which many people miss in the discussion. And that is there is something called NATO, which was created in 1949. The most important element of NATO is Article 5, which in very simple terms is attack on one is attack on all. You know that Ukraine has been very keen to get membership of NATO. There is no NATO in our part of the world. It's not going to happen. Nobody is going to come to India's rescue when there is a violation of its borders. India will have to do it itself, right? And so in that security calculus, when 80% of your weapons are coming from that one country, you are not going to upset your strategic calculus just because there is a war somewhere else. We have to recognize. And we have to recognize that ultimately every state is going to be driven by what is best for its own national interest. Right? So you have the advantage of Article 5 of NATO, you have the advantage of the Treaty of Lisbon, Article 42(7), which again talks about collective defense in some ways. Right? So it's a very difficult equation. A long-term war like this, it's 1 year going on. I have to put it on the table that it doesn't mean that India doesn't recognize the challenge which is coming up. The challenge is that Russia, for a long time, is not going to be in a position to supply weapons to India now. Right. So there is an opportunity. India is looking at expanding, military equipment from other countries, but it doesn't happen just simply like if I've been going to a particular grocery store and I'll stop going there because there is a new one, and I go there. Changing your defense platform, is a tactical thing. And so it has to be really thought out as to how you're going to change your defense platform. But yes, this has opened up an opportunity for India to look at new security partnerships with countries within the European Union and the United States.
Thank you, Rebecca. Next one. Yes, there is one there.
Hi, good afternoon. I would like to know if there are some agreements or work going on with Europe about the climate change topic. Thank you.
So if you know that the Paris Agreement is there on climate change, and there are, emission goals to be met for all countries, and for the countries of the Global South, there is a CBDR, Common but Differentiated Response. So within the context of that, India is having partnerships with different countries in order to, access technology. One of the important critical components in the India-German strategic partnership is on climate change. In terms of bringing technology to move towards a greater amount of renewables, so as to change the component of the energy mix in India's energy basket. So India has been moving steadily on that side. We are also looking at changing, our policy towards automobiles, for example. That's one of the very important elements in the India-EU trade agreement. There's a big, domestically in India, for example, in New Delhi, where I stay, there is a new timeline on vehicles, diesel and petrol. A diesel car is not allowed beyond 10 years. You would have to go in for a new one because the engine is old in design. So these are like more everyday kind of things where you see climate issues are being integrated. But apart from that, when you look at the size of the Indian population, the amount of work which will go in transforming, that is tremendous. So that is where India is looking at specific countries in terms of what they will bring. The challenge with technology transfer is, while governments can enter a partnership, technology is more than 99% developed by private companies. So just because, say, there's a good technology available in Italy, and the Italian government, the Prime Minister is there in India as well, sign an agreement, it's not that automatically a company is going to take a technology into which it has spent the last 4 years with, millions of euro, developing a technology, just giving it away. So you have to find a way in which transfer of technology takes place. So there are modalities being worked out on getting the transfer of technology. But that's an important element. It's also top on the India-EU. Climate partnership is really at the top, because if you would have climate disasters, given the size of India's population, the impact on India is going to be extremely acute. So that's where it is. I mean, definitely on the top, and looking at project-wise implementing what it is. Building satellite imagery, in such a way that data protection, data which is generated through that can help coastal communities, for example, with early warning systems, creating better resilience systems, So we are looking at more local specific problems, because climate change is not something that is just one uniform thing, right? At the end of the day, when you're implementing a project, it is community specific. What are the requirements of a community? So if you're looking at a coastal area and they're looking at an early warning system over there, then we've got one state of India which has more than 50% is desert. And you would have to look at how do you then prevent further desertification and increase green support. In a third state, which is a hill state, we've gone in for more hydroelectric plants, and that has created an environmental impact. So it's constantly a work in progress, but I can tell you that between the member states and India, and on the India-EU, climate partnership is extremely important.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, there is one there.
Thank you. So I have two questions. The first one is, I would like to reconnect to what you said, that right now India is trying to de-escalate the tensions with China. And while that seems to be happening on the military aspect, I would like to ask you what is happening on the cultural aspect, because it seems like that China, for example, is using some sort of Buddhism diplomacy to promote BRI in countries in South Asia, for example, with Nepal and Bangladesh. In Sri Lanka as well, I believe, and I wanted to know what is the Indian take on that, if it feels like it is, an overstepping in its region of influence, for example, and also to put like the EU in the discourse. In 2021, the European Union announced like the new Indo-Pacific strategy, and India plays a key role. I believe that right after the announcement of the strategy, they also signed a connectivity agreement with the EU, which means that India will play a part in that. I want to know if you think that within the aspect of EU-India cooperation within the Indo-Pacific strategy, you think that India can, recalibrate its role as the leading power of South Asia? Thank you.
So that just confirms that I have to come back again, because if you get a question like that, it could be one more lecture. So thank you for the question. Thank you for the question. You're right, I think the de-escalation with China is important for multiple reasons. The military de-escalation. A, because you cannot have sustained military presence at such a high altitude. Given the military skirmishes which have taken place, both sides are looking at getting the troop numbers down and pulling back. But we have to also recognize that China would also project certain things at the border because of its own domestic compulsions. Xi Jinping has, done away with the two-term Chinese presidency. He has gone in for a lifetime of presidency, like Chairman Mao. There's an economic, unraveling happening in China, and all of this offers a good opportunity to scale attention away to the border. So that is one element of it where India would look at de-escalation. And in terms of cultural diplomacy, I think I will separate it out from the BRI, because the BRI is not definitely cultural diplomacy. It's a very hardcore Chinese foreign policy in terms of bringing development, infrastructure development through the BRI, where countries have signed up even from South Asia. India is not part of the BRI. India refused to join the BRI. But what the BRI has produced now in the last, almost coming up to 10 years now, you can see that it has produced a debt diplomacy. Countries are in debt. Sri Lanka is in debt. Pakistan is also facing a domestic crisis. And China is in a position to, advance credit lines and come in and construct at a rate which no other country, not even the EU, is able to compete with it. We have to be very clear about that. So that is definitely looking at realigning the political preferences of the countries of the region. Okay. So for Nepal and Bhutan, the offer would be, don't look at New Delhi. Look at us, because we can give to you whatever you want, right? And they have gone in for that. Part of that realignment also then happens with who's the political leadership. For example, in the Indian Ocean, one of the countries which is now looking at a China offer is a small island country called Maldives. If you look it up on the map, it is very strategically located on the southern part of the Indian Ocean. For India, it's a new equation. The current president says, I'm not going to look at India, I'm going to look at China. Right? So we also see how China is stepping in to realign political preferences over there. In terms of, China has been offering cultural diplomacy through the route of the Confucius Institutes in many countries. They have come to Europe as well. Some of the neighboring countries have been, I remember a discussion came up even in my university to start a Confucius Institute, and we declined it. We said we will not allow that to come in because it was not clear. It was totally state-backed and in terms of allowing access. On the last point, what you said about the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think if you look at the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy, the EU is not, how should I put it, in military sense, a military actor in the Indo-Pacific. But is the EU an economic actor in the Indo-Pacific? And the answer would be absolutely yes. The EU and its member states are actors in the sense of the trade and commerce which is going through the Indo-Pacific. If you read the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy, it's also talking about business cooperation, right? It is not about realpolitik, it's not about realism over there. It's more about business as the way to increase, cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So we've got that element of it, and then more recently, I think, what was it last week? The High Rep Joseph Borrell tweeted that the EU was having a live military exercise for the first time, something unprecedented in all my years of looking at the European Union, which means there's a new kind of idea. But I would say that the Indo-Pacific is not purely only a military space. I think that would be a very, very narrow and limited way of looking at it. The Indo-Pacific is today a point where the geopolitical and the geoeconomic have taken on a new strategic meaning. That is what has happened. And India is one of the actors. It is not the actor, it is one of the actors, right, along with the EU. So the EU and India are looking at it, but the capacities for the European Union to be active in the Indo-Pacific in terms of maritime is extremely limited. Right? The EU has done some kind of anti-piracy operations south of Sudan, in terms of the Horn of Africa and all of their, Gulf of Aden. Operation Atalanta has been done. India has participated in a couple of them. So these are new opportunities which are there for India and the EU. But the Indo-Pacific, like I said, it's still something which is evolving, in which I think every actor is still positioning what its strategic interest is going to be. So it's early days, but we're just in coming to the end of 23. There are three interconnected wars. What is the appetite for engaging with the Indo-Pacific in a more strategic way? That's something which will have to be seen in terms of what the EU will want to do. But there are definitely attempts at creating a better engagement between India and the EU, and in which maritime security has come in as an important component.
Okay, other questions? Okay, so I think, okay, so that's it, I think. Okay, so Professor Bava, thank you very much.